All right, everyone, it's time for Vermont Issues, episode 108, Vermont Businesses for Social Responsibility. It's sort of a political advocacy group. Is pushing for a new gas tax in the state of Vermont, like additional gas taxes, and also a new tax for carbon. Basically, they want people to have to pay more to be in Vermont. And it's a terrible idea. Look, we already pay enormous amounts. We get relatively little out of it. This is the biggest complaint that I have with this state. If you've lived in like Texas or something for any period of time, you'll notice things are so much more cheap, so much less bureaucratic. It's like actually being free. It's like being liberated or something. You know, if you've just been a tourist out of state, you may not have noticed because you're getting like the tourist prices. You know, we do that to people who come in, into this state and do the same thing. You know, they're here for a week. They're going to the touristy places. They're not sure what actual life in Vermont is like, so they think it's quaint and rustic. Then they get their condo here and they realize, I think, how much it really costs. We have dilapidated roads. We have an opiate crisis, and looming property crime as the result of that same crisis. Most of the kids that do get a really good education in this state, which is one of the things we pay a lot for, they have to go out of state to get a job. You know, if they decide to take up the state's offer of, hey, you know, in-state tuition, like Castleton or whatever, and you can get a world-class education, but then they have to go somewhere else to actually work, like people who go into nursing, they can find a job in this state because, you know, the state's population is aging. And if they do like blue-collar work, like they do electrical work or carpentry, they can usually get by. Automotive, certainly. Outside of that, there's not a whole fucking lot in this state for them to actually do, and now we've got all these groups that want us to pay more and more money. What exactly the fuck are we getting out of it? A carbon tax should never be employed. The very idea of a carbon tax that keeps getting bandied around by all these world governments and all these so-called environmental leaders, you're crazy if you think that will actually stop global warming. If that's your beef, if your beef is environmental and you think that we need to stop climate change, exporting all that actual pollution to some other country doesn't solve the problem. That's exactly the result of 20 years of environmental and anti-business legislation has simply shifted all the heavy industry to Southeast Asia. It didn't go away, it's just not on the North American continent anymore, so we don't have to deal directly with the impact of it. We also don't get the good jobs from it. Somebody else does. Now over here, we could scrub things and keep them a lot cleaner. We could have worker protections. People could get a decent wage. Instead, some slave in China who makes 10 cents an hour, some 10-year-old kid who will never even go to school, they're the one that has to play around in the coal mine. Wonderful. You've done such a wonderful thing for the world. No, it's the not in my backyard, out of sight, out of mind mentality. It's not moral, it's not environmentally friendly, it's a ploy, it's a ruse, it's a dirty trick for them to re-import goods, make them cheaper, and keep people less wealthy so they don't have the leisure time to educate themselves on issues and so that they can try to control people more. That's ultimately what it's about. As for the idea of a gas tax, pretty sure there's already a gasoline tax in Vermont. It's like there's a tax on everything else. Yeah, everything you do in this state is taxed. That's one of the fundamental problems. We've never had. I saw another article, and it was as part of my sort of morning research into the Vermont news. I looked through multiple articles, and another one was like, oh, it was actually from VPR, I think. They were talking about Vermont secession. They were like, well, we're not endorsing this, but we're going to do like an experiment here and talk about what would maybe happen. One of the justifications for people being interested in the topic was, well, maybe Vermonters will look to secede because the federal government is going to get smaller. It's going to shrink. Yeah, exactly. That's the problem. That's the shitty mentality that's led to the situation we have in this state, where we have basically no growth, very few good jobs. Entrepreneurs get taxed up the ass too. They'll leave the state. I want to leave the state of Vermont myself. Why do you think I want to leave? It's not because I have some other problem with it. The crime rate's low. That's wonderful. It's nice and clean. It's filled with nature. I don't have to be around large crowds and in a big city. Those are all good things. I like that about the state. but the amount that you pay for that doesn't make sense when you have other states where you get fundamentally the same thing in any other small town America zone, minus in many cases the opiate epidemic and maybe even less crime. You can get the same thing and pay half as much to the state. So why the heck would I want to pay? The top tax rate, I think, in the state of Vermont approaches 8% state income tax. 8%, and the threshold's not that much higher than where I am, I think, now. I'm certainly in the third bracket already, so I think for me it's like 4 point something percent. You realize how high that is? There are states that don't have a state income tax. You go to Texas, they want $0. It doesn't matter what you make. They don't care. There's half the taxes that we have here, half the fees and taxes don't exist in many other states, or they're comparatively far lower. And yet these states manage to get by. The fact that they're not number one in education, look, I think New Hampshire's number 2, Minnesota's number 3, and I believe both of them have substantially lower overall costs of living than Vermont, unless you're living in an urban part of these states. Like you're living in like a really, really nice place in Manchester in New Hampshire, or maybe right on the beach in Hampton, yeah, probably you're paying through the nose. If you're living in like Minneapolis and you're living in the nice neighborhood, yeah, you probably paid like, you know, $600,000-$700,000 for your little townhouse. Okay, maybe point taken. What about small town America around these zones? Yeah, I think it's a lot cheaper. And those people, they pay less. They get the same thing out of it. It's still clean. You know, New Hampshire is still a clean state. It's basically the same as Vermont. You go across the border, and if it weren't for the Connecticut River being there, you wouldn't realize you would change states. You honestly wouldn't. There's no magical barrier between glorious green hippie Vermont with you know, all happy progressive stuff and those backwards New Hampshire people over there. They don't pay as much, so their state is shitty. It's not the way it works. You can't tell the difference. Been over in New Hampshire many times. It's rather nice. It's not falling apart because they pay less money to be there. Not the way it works. We are taxed enough as is. In fact, we're taxed far too much. We should look into slashing and burning as many state bureaus and agencies off of our budget as possible. Get rid of them. Consolidate, streamline, and make more efficient what needs to actually be done. Look for any way to save money and then pass that on to people. Now, within the state, try to drop the tax rate as far as we can possibly drop it. Property taxes should drop. State income tax should drop. There should be no new fees, regulatory bullshit. We should do away with as many of those as possible, too. If that means firing a bunch of state workers, who cares? At least at the state level, yeah, it would be wonderful to do that. And all the state, you know, some state worker might see this. Sorry, but you may be an effective worker. Maybe your job is actually important. But there are also those there whose jobs are not important. They're simply being paid to sit around in some cases. That's a problem. It's a problem in D.C. too. Now, we're willing to aim that criticism at D.C. Oh, look at all the bureaucrats and all. We pay these people too much. This person's getting $70,000 and they work like 2 hours a week. What the hell are we paying for? That's right. Aim the same criticism at Montpelier and you'll begin to see, I think, one of the reasons why the state's tax rate is so high. And then you get all the local taxes and fees too. You pay through the nose for that too. Again, generally for dilapidated roads and subpar services on all possible ends. How wonderful. How absolutely lovely. Now let's have a carbon tax. No, you know what'll happen? At some critical point, a majority of the state's population will no longer be able to deal with the amount of fees and regulatory burdens within the state. And they will begin to move. They'll leave if they can. In fact, a lot of them probably would be smart to leave as soon as possible anyway, because the problem is if the state screws itself so that nobody wants to move in, then you can't even like sell your house or anything off before you leave to some wealthy person. Maybe the state of Vermont, I think the state of Vermont just wants to have a handful of really, really rich people with all the land and then a bunch of service workers who basically are their slaves. That appears to be what they want. I happen to think that's a bad thing. I think having a stronger middle class is better. I think having a working class appeal is better. So the people who are working, again, that $15, $20 an hour job, they're a janitor, they're a carpenter, they do automotive work, they can get ahead. They can have their plot, and they can have their trees, and they can be left alone. They don't have to live in some subsidized tenement. I think that we should attempt that as a state. And it's possible. Look, we're a little state. If anyone can do it, we can, but we need to switch what we're doing. That's about all. Peace out.